A black CEO, returning from a business trip, was ready to start her day like any other. But the moment she stepped into the lobby of her own building, everything changed. A security guard, blinded by prejudice, blocked her path, demanding to know why she was there. Humiliated in front of employees and clients, she calmly presented her credentials, yet the guard refused to believe her. Just 10 minutes later, after a single phone call, the truth unraveled and the guard was fired on the spot. What happened next rippled through the company and sparked a conversation that no one expected. Stay with me, this is a story that reveals how power, prejudice, and justice collide in the most unexpected places. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful content that sheds light on resilience and justice. The terminal was quiet in the way that expensive places often are, where silence is a luxury only afforded to those who have long ceased to question their belonging. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath warm lights, reflecting polished shoes and trailing shadows of men and women who had long made peace with their entitlement to such spaces. Amelia Carter's steps, deliberate and soft, echoed louder than any other. She entered without ceremony, dressed in a crisp white blazer that draped over her like armor. Her hair, cut short and silver at the temples, marked the years not as wear but as triumph. Yet, for all the weight of her success, Amelia understood something that never left her no matter how high she climbed. She would always carry the ghosts of those who could not rise alongside her. The girl at the desk smiled too quickly. Her hands fluttered over the keyboard as Amelia approached, eyes darting once, then twice, toward the expensive leather carry-on she rolled behind her. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" There was no hostility in her voice, only the soft tremor of someone unsure of the script. Amelia answered with the kind of calm that comes from repetition. "The Carter jet to New York. I believe it's already on the tarmac." The girl's smile faltered, but she caught herself. "Oh, of course, Miss Carter. One moment." Amelia stepped aside as the girl typed. There was a flicker of hesitation, the way her gaze clung to the screen longer than necessary, scanning for a mistake that wasn't there. Amelia had seen this before, a disbelief that success could wear skin like hers. Her attention drifted toward the wide glass windows. Outside, the jet stood waiting, sleek and white against the endless stretch of blue sky. It bore no insignia, only the faint gleam of her initials, carved discreetly near the door. A possession that spoke not of inheritance, but of years spent climbing, bruised and breathless, past men who believed her place was only beside power, never the bearer of it. It wasn't the jet she noticed most, but the man beside it. Captain Harold Price stood with one foot on the stairs leading into the aircraft, his hands resting in tight fists against his hips. His eyes moved across the terminal, scanning the faces that passed, but they never lingered on Amelia. Not at first. When they did, it was not with recognition, but with curiosity, the sort of curiosity that bends toward suspicion. His steps were slow, methodical as he approached. "Miss Carter," he said, the words deliberate but distant. "I'm Captain Price. I assume you're here to board?" "Assume?" Amelia smiled faintly. "I am." For a moment, they held each other's gaze in the space between formality and confrontation. Price glanced once more at her luggage. His mouth opened, but whatever question lay on his tongue, he swallowed it. Instead, he nodded and gestured toward the stairs. It was subtle, the shift in his posture as she passed, the quiet narrowing of his eyes as though some part of him struggled to reconcile the sight of her with the reality of the aircraft she now stepped into. Amelia felt the weight of his stare even as she disappeared inside. Some battles announce themselves with a shout. Others begin in silence, in the careful arrangement of expressions and the unspoken disbelief that lingers long after the encounter has ended. This, Amelia knew, was the beginning of the latter. The jet's engines hummed faintly beneath Amelia Carter, a sound she had come to know well over the years, a soft, constant reminder of her success. She let it wash over her like a distant tide, steady but never comforting. Success, after all, had never been a refuge. It was a platform, and platforms were precarious things, balanced on the shifting sands of perception. The glass of water sat untouched on the table beside her. She watched condensation gather along its rim, small droplets sliding downward like time folding over itself. From the corner of her eye, She saw him again. Captain Harold Price lingered at the edge of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones to the co-pilot. There was no malice in his expression, no sneer or frown that could be easily named. But there was something else. Something quieter, like the faintest wrinkle on the surface of still water. Amelia had long since learned to read such things. It wasn't hatred that followed her into rooms like these. It was doubt. Doubt, she found, was sharper, more persistent. "Ms. Carter." Price's voice broke through the soft hum, and Amelia turned her head with the slow deliberation of someone who was accustomed to being interrupted. "Yes, Captain?" Price stepped forward, his cap tucked beneath his arm, eyes cautious as they met hers. "I wanted to confirm," he began, the words rolling out carefully, as though each one needed its own approval before leaving his lips. "We're scheduled to depart shortly. But I couldn't help but notice, well, I didn't realize you'd be flying alone today." "Alone?" Amelia let the word linger between them, soft and sharp at the same time. "Yes," she replied simply. "Is that unusual?" Price shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze flickering to the empty seats around her. "It's just rare," he said, and though his tone was light, it carried the unmistakable weight of judgment dressed as curiosity. "Most private jet owners don't often fly without company or staff. I like to make sure everything is in order." Amelia smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Everything is in order, Captain, I assure you." For a moment, the cabin felt smaller, the space between them dense with something unspoken. But Price did not move. "If I may," he continued, voice dipping lower, "I wasn't aware that Carter Holdings had expanded into private aviation. Forgive me for saying so, but I thought most of your business was in textiles and manufacturing." The words were polite, neutral, even, but Amelia heard them for what they were, a question that had nothing to do with business. She leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Carter Holdings hasn't expanded," she said calmly. "I purchased this jet for personal use." A flicker of something passed over Price's face, surprise. Perhaps, or perhaps confirmation of whatever narrative he had already begun to weave in his mind. "I see," he said, but the doubt lingered in his voice. "Apologies for the misunderstanding." Amelia held his gaze for a moment longer, letting the weight of her silence press against him. "There's nothing to apologize for," she said finally, though they both knew that wasn't true. Price nodded stiffly, retreating to the cockpit. The door hissed shut behind him, but Amelia felt his presence like a shadow just beyond the glass. She exhaled slowly, fingers brushing the rim of the glass beside her. This wasn't hostility, not yet. But the road to open disrespect was often paved by the steady drip of doubt. And Amelia had learned to recognize the signs. The questions always began politely, but they would not stay that way. Not if history had taught her anything. The jet began to roll, smooth as silk over glass, and Amelia Carter watched the tarmac drift by through the cabin window. The sky stretched wide and pale above her, but she could not shake the sensation that something narrower, something heavier, lingered inside. She glanced at her watch. Takeoff should have begun 5 minutes ago. But they hadn't moved fast enough. Not quite. The glass of water sat untouched beside her. The condensation had long since dried, leaving a faint circle on the polished surface of the table. The smallest Mark I she hadn't left, but would still be expected to account for. The door to the cockpit cracked open once again, and she did not need to turn her head to know who stood behind her. Captain Harold Price cleared his throat. A soft interruption wrapped in the cloth of authority. "Ms. Carter," he began, stepping forward with the deliberation of a man who believed he was in control. "I apologize for the delay. It's just that." His hesitation filled the cabin like smoke. "There seems to be an issue with the paperwork." Amelia turned slowly, her eyes calm but unyielding. "An issue?" Price nodded, but she caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Yes, I spoke with ground control, and they flagged a discrepancy with the listed owner. I thought it best to confirm directly. Just a precaution, of course." There it was. Not hatred, not outright denial, just doubt, wrapped in bureaucracy, delivered with the gentle hand of professionalism. Amelia did not smile this time. She folded her hands carefully in her lap, her posture a deliberate stillness that drew Price's gaze downward, as though searching for cracks he would not find. "I assume," she said, her voice soft but edged with steel, You already confirmed with the terminal? Price hesitated. Well, I wanted to be thorough. I see. She let the silence stretch, watching as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Tell me something, Captain, she said finally. When Mr. Holbrook flew out last week, did you confirm his ownership as well? Price blinked. Mr. Holbrook? Yes, Amelia replied. Tall man, gray hair, flies with a glass of bourbon in hand. If I recall. No, ma'am, Mr. Holbrook is a regular client. And I, Amelia said, am the owner of this aircraft. Price opened his mouth, but no words came. Let me make something clear. Amelia continued, her voice never rising, but sharpening with every word. You may question the engine, the fuel, or the weather, but you will not question my presence on this plane. The cabin felt smaller now, the weight of her words pressing against the leather-lined walls. Price shifted his gaze, glancing once toward the cockpit door as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Of course, Miss Carter, he said at last, the words quiet and clipped. I'll see to it that we depart immediately. He turned, retreating as swiftly as he had come. The cockpit door slid shut behind him. But Amelia did not relax. She knew how these things worked. Politeness was a mask that could slip at any moment. And men like Price never liked being told no. The engines roared softly to life beneath her. And Amelia Carter leaned back into her seat. She had won this round. But she also knew the fight was far from over. The jet had reached its cruising altitude, slicing clean through the sky. But the air inside the cabin felt heavier than it should. Amelia Carter sat in the stillness. Though stillness was not what she felt. She had known enough men like Harold Price to understand that his retreat was not surrender, it was recalibration. A man like him did not walk away from doubt, he tucked it away. Saved it for later. He would carry it in his pocket, rolling it between his fingers, waiting for the moment he believed he could pull it out again without consequence. She felt the shift long before she saw him. The soft creak of the cockpit door. The light shuffle of steps along the cabin's plush carpet. Miss Carter, Price said, his voice smoother this time, as if he'd decided to change tactics. He stood just beyond her seat, cap still tucked beneath his arm, eyes fixed politely but firmly ahead. Yes, Captain? Amelia replied without turning her head. I was reviewing the flight plan, he said, careful now, like a man picking his way through tall grass. It's a long stretch to New York. And I wanted to check in. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer a stopover? Perhaps a break during the flight? A pause. No, Amelia said plainly. The way he phrased it sounded generous, a break during the flight, as if his concern was rooted in her comfort. But Amelia knew better. She finally turned her gaze toward him. Slow and deliberate. I didn't realize my itinerary required your approval. Price's expression remained neutral, but the slightest flicker of tension crossed his eyes. Not at all, ma'am, he replied smoothly. Just a suggestion. Many clients prefer to avoid extended travel without staff on board. I thought I'd offer. You thought you'd offer, Amelia repeated quietly, letting the words linger between them. She let her eyes hold his, just long enough for discomfort to take root. Tell me, Captain, she said, leaning back slightly, how often do you suggest stopovers to clients who look like Mr. Holbrook? Price stiffened, though the shift was almost imperceptible. It's not about appearances, he said, too quickly. It's about ensuring our clients feel at ease. Amelia smiled faintly, though there was no humor behind it. I am at ease, Captain, or at least I was. Until I began to wonder why the man flying my jet seems so uncomfortable with me being here. His lips parted slightly as if to protest. But Amelia's eyes narrowed just enough to stop him. You have a job to do, she said, her voice soft but unrelenting. I suggest you focus on that instead of worrying about how I spend my time in the air. Price swallowed, his throat working against the silence. Yes, ma'am, he said finally, bowing his head just enough to acknowledge the point she had driven home. As he stepped back toward the cockpit, Amelia's eyes followed him. It was always like this. Always polite, always subtle, until it wasn't. She had spent her life sitting in boardrooms, standing at podiums, walking into rooms full of men like Price, men who smiled even as they sharpened their knives beneath the table. And yet, no matter how far she climbed, the questions never stopped. Are you sure you belong here? Shouldn't you be accompanied by someone else? Wouldn't you feel more comfortable somewhere different? These questions were never asked outright. They came wrapped in suggestion, offered under the guise of helpfulness. But make no mistake, help had nothing to do with it. Amelia turned her gaze back toward the window, watching as the clouds stretched endlessly below. She had no interest in stopovers. There was no time to rest. Not when she was still expected to prove, over and over again, that the seat she occupied had been earned. The sky outside stretched on in every direction, vast and indifferent. Amelia Carter had always found the sky to be the great equalizer, boundless, without allegiance. Up here, land was divided by clouds, not borders. But even at 40,000 feet, some things refused to stay grounded. She could feel Harold Price's gaze before she saw him. He hadn't emerged from the cockpit again, but his presence lingered in the hush of the cabin. Doubt, when left unattended, has a way of expanding to fill every quiet space. Amelia set her tablet aside, glancing toward the polished cockpit door. It sat flush against the wall, sleek and unassuming, and yet, the longer she stared at it, the more it seemed to bear down on her like the silent witness of a conversation that hadn't yet ended. It was never the first challenge that disturbed her. It was the second, the third. The insistence, prejudice, she thought, did not announce itself with a fanfare. It crept forward with soft steps. A polite cough, a concerned smile. It was always gentle until it wasn't. A soft knock broke her reverie. She looked up to see the flight attendant Marcus, if she recalled correctly, standing at the edge of her seat. His hands were folded in front of him, his smile practiced but thin. "Miss Carter," he began quietly, glancing toward the cockpit door as if to ensure it stayed shut. "Can I offer you something else? Coffee, perhaps?" Amelia studied him for a moment. His discomfort was subtle but visible, resting at the edge of his eyes. "No, thank you," she replied, though her gaze didn't leave his face. "I take it the captain is having a difficult flight?" Marcus hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "He's just particular," he said carefully. "Some of the older pilots are." "Older pilots," Amelia repeated, a faint smile touching her lips. "Yes, I imagine they are." Marcus nodded, offering nothing further. She could see the tightrope he walked. Men like Marcus, young, polite, and likely ambitious, knew better than to speak plainly. There was no future for crew members who named what was happening in the open. They watched, they learned, and if they were careful, they endured. But Amelia was not Marcus. She had not come this far by enduring. She let the silence stretch for a beat longer, before softening her gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate your professionalism." Marcus's shoulders eased just slightly, and he gave a quick nod before stepping back toward the galley. As he disappeared behind the curtain, Amelia's eyes returned to the cockpit door. She could wait. Men like Price always returned. And when he did, Amelia would be ready. The jet hummed softly beneath her. But the sky felt still, as though it too was waiting for what came next. The engines hummed steady, but there was a weight beneath the wings now, a tension that had settled in the bones of the plane. In the way the air pressed in tighter around the cabin, Amelia Carter could feel it as she sat by the window, watching the clouds unspool beneath her like slow-moving ghosts. She didn't need to look at the cockpit door to know Captain Harold Price was standing behind it. Wrestling with himself, men like him didn't yield easily. They let their discomfort ferment, kept their grievances in their pockets, turning them over like loose change until the need to be heard outweighed the need to be discreet. And so she waited, knowing that doubt, when left to fester, always found its voice. When the cockpit door finally opened, the sound of it sliding back was soft, but Amelia felt it like a shift in the air. Price approached with the careful precision of a man pretending to search for common ground. His steps, his posture, everything was too measured, too deliberate. This was not apology. This was the prelude to justification. "Ms. Carter," he said, stopping just short of her seat. His voice carried that tone she knew well, something polite, laced with the fragile authority of a man whose confidence had begun to fray. "I hope you're comfortable." Amelia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she met his gaze with the quiet patience of someone who understood the nature of storms. "You didn't rush them. You waited. You let them come to you." "Quite," she said at last. "Is there something I can help you with, Captain?" Price shifted slightly, his cap still tucked beneath his arm. "It's not often we see someone flying alone in a jet like this," he said, as if explaining something. It's rare, that's all. Most of our clients. He stopped himself, but it was too late. The words had already taken shape between them. Most of our clients. Amelia nodded, folding her hands in her lap. I imagine most of your clients don't look like me, she said calmly. Price stiffened. That's not what I meant, he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. No? Amelia arched a brow. Then what did you mean, Captain? He opened his mouth to answer, but found nothing, because there was no other meaning. Not really. I've flown on this jet more times than I can count, Amelia continued, her voice soft but sharp, like silk pressed over glass. And yet, every time I return, someone like you is standing here, asking me if I belong in my own seat. Price's grip tightened around his cap. It's not personal, he said. Amelia smiled faintly. It's always personal, Captain. It just doesn't feel that way to the person asking the questions. The cabin felt smaller now, the space between them heavy with something that neither of them could shift. Let me ask you something, Amelia said, leaning forward slightly. When you first saw me step onto this jet, when you looked at me standing alone at the terminal, what did you think? Price hesitated. Amelia tilted her head, eyes narrowing just enough to catch the flicker of discomfort that crossed his face. You thought there'd been a mistake, she answered for him, didn't you? Price's silence was an answer in itself. Amelia let it sit there, unchallenged. You see, she said quietly, the difference between you and me, Captain, is that I can feel it the moment I walk into a room. That question whether I belong here is the first thing I'm greeted with. But for you, it's the last thing you ever have to consider. Price looked away, his gaze drifting toward the window as if the sky might offer him an escape. I'm just doing my job, he muttered. No, Amelia said, and her voice now carried the full weight of the conversation. You're doing more than that. You're deciding who gets to feel comfortable up here. And you've decided it shouldn't be me. Price's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. The clouds outside stretched endlessly, indifferent to the quiet battle taking place within the cabin. I suggest, Amelia said finally, leaning back in her seat, that you return to the cockpit and focus on what's in front of you. I have no intention of justifying myself any further today. For a long moment, Price stood there, his posture rigid, his pride simmering just beneath the surface. But there was nothing left to say, not without revealing more than he was prepared to. Yes, ma'am, he said stiffly, turning back toward the cockpit. As the door slid shut behind him, Amelia let out a slow breath. She had won, but the sky outside still felt narrow. It always did. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like distant thunder, low and steady, but Amelia Carter could feel the tension curling just beneath it, alive and growing. The sky outside was endless, but inside the jet, the air felt tight, coiled like something waiting to spring. She had not seen Captain Harold Price since their last exchange, but she knew his silence wasn't surrender. No, men like Price didn't give up. They retreated long enough to convince themselves they were right, and that whatever slight they imagined had to be corrected. The question wasn't if he would return. It was how. Amelia shifted in her seat, eyes drifting across the empty cabin. There was a stillness to wealth, to spaces built for power, the kind of stillness that made the slightest disturbance feel amplified. She had always felt it, even in the rooms she owned. The weight of being the only one, the only woman, the only black face, the only question mark. A quiet knock stirred her thoughts. The flight attendant Marcus stood at the edge of the cabin once more. But there was something different about him now. His polite smile had thinned, and his eyes flickered toward the cockpit. Wary. Miss Carter, he said softly, may I speak with you? She gestured for him to sit. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if to ensure they were alone, then carefully lowered himself into the seat across from her. There's something you should know, Marcus began, his voice hushed but urgent. Captain Price's requested that we run a secondary security check before landing. Amelia's gaze sharpened. Security check? Marcus nodded, lowering his voice further. He's claiming it's protocol, something about verifying passenger credentials. But, ma'am, we've never done that before. Not in flight. Amelia leaned back, folding her arms. There it was. The second wave. She had seen this pattern play out 100 different ways. If Price couldn't find the words to challenge her ownership outright, he would let the system do the talking for him. It's not about security, Amelia said, her voice calm but heavy. "It's about making sure I remember my place." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I thought you should know." He hesitated. "I didn't feel right keeping quiet." Amelia studied him for a long moment. There was something familiar in the way he held himself, the quiet diplomacy, the careful weight of choosing his battles. "I appreciate that, Marcus," she said softly. "But let me ask you something." "Why tell me this?" Marcus's eyes flickered. "Uncertain. Because I know how this goes," he admitted quietly. "I've seen it happen before. They don't stop until someone pushes back." Amelia smiled faintly. "And you thought I'd push back?" Marcus glanced toward the cockpit once more, lowering his voice even further. "I thought maybe you already were." For a moment, the two sat in silence, the hum of the engines pressing in around them. "You can tell Captain Price I'll be ready for his questions," Amelia said finally, her voice smooth as glass. Marcus nodded, but before he rose, Amelia placed a hand gently on the table between them. "Marcus," she said, her tone soft but certain, "don't let men like him make you small." He swallowed, nodding slightly before retreating to the galley. As the curtain fell back into place, Amelia felt the weight settle deeper in her chest. There was no quiet way to exist in a space you weren't meant to occupy. But she had never been interested in moving quietly. The sky outside remained vast and indifferent. But inside, Amelia Carter prepared for whatever storm Harold Price thought he was bringing her way. The jet began its slow descent, the engines shifting into a lower hum that filled the cabin with a soft, vibrating pulse. The clouds outside thinned, revealing the distant outlines of the New York skyline bathed in the dying light of day. But Amelia Carter's eyes weren't on the horizon. She watched the cockpit door, waiting. It didn't take long. Captain Harold Price emerged, his footsteps deliberate, each one a quiet announcement of his return. He didn't bother with the polite hesitation this time. There was a stiffness in his shoulders now, the kind men wore when they were convinced they had been wronged. He stopped just beside her seat, clearing his throat like someone who believed he held the upper hand. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but pressing, "I wanted to let you know that we'll be running a routine security check upon landing. Standard protocol." Amelia met his gaze calmly. "You and I both know there's nothing routine about it." A flicker of irritation passed over his face, though he tried to smooth it away. "It's for your safety," Price replied, but even he didn't sound convinced. Amelia let the silence stretch, watching as Price shifted under the weight of it. "Let me ask you something, Captain," she said, tilting her head slightly. "How many flights have you piloted where the owner of the jet had to prove they belonged there?" Price didn't answer. She could see him wrestling with it, the quiet battle playing out behind his eyes. This wasn't about security. It was about control, about making sure the boundaries, those unspoken, invisible lines that divided who was allowed to move freely and who wasn't, remained intact. "I imagine it's not often," Amelia continued, her voice soft but cutting. "But I suppose we both understand that I am rarely afforded the luxury of being just another passenger." Price opened his mouth to respond, but she raised a hand, stopping him. "I know men like you, Captain," she said, her gaze never wavering. "I've met them in boardrooms, across negotiating tables, and in every space I've had to carve out for myself. And the thing about men like you is that you never ask these questions to protect anyone but yourselves." His face tightened, but Amelia pressed on. "You see, you think if you question me long enough, I'll eventually explain myself, justify why I'm here, and maybe that will make you more comfortable. But I have nothing to explain." The cabin felt smaller now. The air taut as Price's pride waged a silent war within him. "I could call the tower right now," Amelia said quietly, "and have you grounded before we even touch the tarmac. But I won't." Price blinked, uncertain. "I won't," she repeated, "because unlike you, I understand what it means to carry something heavier than doubt. I know what it is to carry grace, even when it is not deserved." Price's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, there was no mask of professionalism, no polished veneer of authority. There was only silence. "I suggest," Amelia said, leaning back into her seat, "that you let the tower know we'll be landing without incident." Price's grip tightened around his cap, but after a long pause, he nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am." He turned and disappeared into the cockpit without another word. The engines groaned softly as the jet descended, cutting through the thin veil of clouds. Amelia closed her eyes briefly, letting the quiet settle around her. She had won the battle. But the war was older than both of them. It did not end with words exchanged at 30,000 feet. It followed her to the ground, walked beside her through the streets, sat at the table during business meetings, and whispered behind her in the hallways of places she should have never needed permission to enter. The wheels touched down, the slight jolt snapping her eyes open. As the jet taxied toward the hangar, Amelia Carter glanced out the window, watching as the runway lights flickered against the fading sky. She had fought this fight before, and she would fight it again. Because that, after all, was the price of flying in a world determined to clip your wings.